My name is William Thompson, and I never thought the deadliest betrayal of my life would come from inside my own family. One night, as I sat at my grandson's side, he leaned close and whispered words that froze the blood in my veins. "Grandpa, my parents are trying to hurt you." That moment shattered everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the future I had built with my own two hands. What followed was a storm of deception, police sirens, and courtroom battles that no father should ever endure. But in the middle of it all, a boy's courage saved my life and forced the truth into the open. Before we begin, I want to ask, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like mine. I had weathered countless negotiations in my career, but nothing prepared me for the sight of my own son storming into my office like a hostile rival. The heavy oak door slammed so hard against the wall that the windows rattled. Papers slipped from his white-knuckled fist and scattered across my mahogany desk, burying the quarterly reports I had been reviewing. "You're too old for this," Dad Cleveland declared, his voice sharp, with the arrogance of someone who had convinced himself he was invincible. "You can't handle it anymore." For a long moment, I simply removed my glasses and set them down with deliberate calm, a habit learned from years of high-stakes meetings. I looked at him, the son I had raised, the boy I once taught to organize my tools in the garage, now glaring at me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle in his way. "What exactly can't I handle, Cleveland?" I asked evenly, though inside my chest a storm began to brew. He began pacing like a caged animal, expensive suit wrinkling with each impatient stride. "The company needs fresh leadership, modern thinking. You're stuck in the past, while competitors are racing ahead." His words weren't just business jargon, they were accusations. Each one struck like a blade, as if the decades I had devoted to building Thompson Manufacturing from a fragile startup into a thriving enterprise meant nothing. I stood slowly, meeting him eye to eye. Despite my 68 years, I still carried myself with the presence of the man who had built this empire brick by brick. "And you believe you're ready to provide that leadership?" My voice stayed steady, but the weight of his words pressed hard against me. "I know I am." He leaned forward, palms slamming down on my desk, shaking the family photo of his graduation day. "I've been ready for years. You just refuse to see it, because you can't let go." The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting shadows that made him look older, harder. I searched for a glimpse of the eager young man who once celebrated every small victory at my side. Instead, I saw ambition twisted into something darker. Yesterday I reminded him, "You wanted to saddle us with reckless loans for untested technology. Last month you suggested firing half our workforce to chase temporary profits. That's not leadership, it's destruction." He sneered, jaw tight. "That's called adapting to survive. While you're protecting every employee like their family, our competitors are streamlining and tripling revenue. The only thing holding Thompson Manufacturing back is your stubbornness." I walked around the desk until I stood directly in front of him. "And in the process, you'd destroy everything we've built." His response cut deeper than he knew. "Everything we've built. I've worked here 15 years, Dad. I know this business inside and out. The only thing standing in the way is you." I studied him for a long breath, and in that silence I felt the shift. This wasn't just a disagreement about business strategy. This was a declaration of war. For the first time in my life, my son no longer looked like family, he looked like a rival. His words didn't carry the tone of a discussion, they carried the weight of an ultimatum. My chest tightened as I thought back to the countless sacrifices I had made to give him a stable life. Sacrifices he now brushed aside, as if they were worthless relics of another era. I'm not asking permission anymore, he said coldly, straightening his tie. That phrase echoed in my head, like the toll of a bell announcing the death of something sacred. I let the silence hang between us, choosing not to respond in anger. Instead, I studied him carefully, as I had done with opponents across negotiating tables. But this was different. This was my own flesh and blood. Cleveland, I said slowly, what you're proposing isn't leadership. It's a hostile takeover. He smirked the kind of smile I had seen before on competitors who believed they had me cornered. Call it whatever you want. I call it survival. His confidence was chilling. I felt the sting of humiliation course through me. The boy who once ran through our modest garage, eager to fetch me wrenches and screws, was now standing tall in my office, convinced he could run me out of my own legacy. That memory flashed across my mind with painful clarity, the smell of machine oil, his youthful grin smeared with grease, his endless questions about how engines worked. I had been proud then, certain I was passing down not just a company, but a way of life. Now I wasn't sure I recognized the man standing in front of me. Do you even hear yourself? I asked, my voice sharper now, the patience beginning to fray. You're talking about dismantling values that have carried this business for decades. Values I hoped you would honor. He scoffed, shaking his head as if I were a naive old man clinging to fairy tales. Values don't pay the bills, Dad. Numbers do. And the numbers say it's time for you to step aside. For a moment, my office seemed to shrink. The walls that had witnessed decades of triumphs now closed in on me, suffocating under the weight of his betrayal. I realized I wasn't just fighting to keep a company alive. I was fighting to preserve the soul of everything I had built. Be careful, son. I warned, my voice low, almost trembling from the anger I restrained. The path you're walking doesn't just strip me of authority. It strips you of your humanity. He grabbed the stack of papers he had thrown earlier and shoved them back into his briefcase. Think about it, Dad. Think about what's best for everyone. But one way or another, this transition is happening. With that, he walked out, slamming the door so hard that the window frames rattled again. Alone in my office, I stood frozen, staring at the door as if it had swallowed him whole. The humiliation burned deeper than any business loss I had ever endured. For the first time, I understood the bitter truth: my son had declared himself my enemy. The echo of the slamming door lingered long after Cleveland had gone, a sound that carried more weight than any gavel in a courtroom. I stood by my desk, staring at the scattered papers he had left behind, my nameplate slightly askew from the force of his fists. For decades, this office had been my sanctuary, the place where I celebrated victories and shouldered defeats. But now it felt tainted, as though my son's words had poisoned the very air. He threatened to take everything, whether I agreed or not. The phrase replayed in my mind until it became unbearable. This wasn't a careless outburst. It was a calculated statement. My own son was no longer looking for guidance or approval. He was issuing orders, stripping me of dignity, as though I were an employee past his usefulness. I sat down, slowly running my fingers along the worn grooves of the mahogany desk I had purchased in those lean early years. That desk had borne witness to endless nights of contracts, deals, and prayers whispered in exhaustion. I had built this company with my sweat, my sleepless nights, my unwavering faith in hard work. To Cleveland, it seemed nothing more than a prize to be seized. Anger welled up, but beneath it was a deeper wound: humiliation. There's a sting in being called irrelevant by strangers, but to hear it from your own flesh and blood, it cut deeper than any business rivalry ever could. He hadn't asked me to step aside gracefully. He had declared war using the language of entitlement and greed. I pushed myself up from the chair and walked to the window. The city stretched out before me, Lake Erie shimmering in the distance. For 30 years, that view had been a symbol of progress, a reminder of what perseverance could achieve. Today, it felt like a battlefield, and I realized I was standing at the center of a storm I hadn't chosen. I remembered teaching Cleveland how to shake a man's hand firmly, how to look people in the eye, how to respect the employees who kept the gears turning. I remembered telling him that a company wasn't just steel and contracts, it was people, families, livelihoods. But now he wanted to gut those values for short-term profits. The realization made my stomach churn. When I turned back toward my desk, I caught sight of that family photo again, the one from his college graduation. He had stood beside me with a smile so wide, so genuine that I believed he shared my vision. Looking at it now, I could barely reconcile that young man with the cold figure who had threatened me moments ago. I clenched my fists not out of rage but to steady myself. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation I could walk away from. This was my legacy, my life's work, and my very family bond under attack. The humiliation of this moment would not be forgotten. It would be the scar that reminded me what was at stake. And though he thought he had the upper hand, one thing was clear: if Cleveland wanted a war, then he had just declared it. That night, I sat alone in my study, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock, louder than any voice. The confrontation with Cleveland replayed endlessly in my mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim lamplight, and took a slow sip, feeling the burn down my throat. It did nothing to calm the fire of humiliation and betrayal that churned inside me. I thought back to the early days of Thompson Manufacturing. From a tiny garage with just a handful of machines, Cleveland had watched me work late into the night, taking risks that could have bankrupted us, dreaming bigger than our means allowed. I remembered explaining every process to him, letting him feel the weight of responsibility firsthand. Every contract, every deal had been a lesson in patience and resilience. And yet here he was, years later, ready to erase all of it with a flick of his hand. I considered the company itself, the people who depended on it, the employees whose livelihoods I had protected through recessions, market crashes, and unpredictable clients. Cleveland wanted to fire half of them in a single reckless move. Adapt to survive, he had called it. But I knew the true cost of survival. It wasn't just money. It was trust, loyalty, and integrity. Leaning back in my chair, I let my thoughts drift to Ethan, my grandson. The boy's bright eyes, so full of curiosity and courage, reminded me that the family I loved most wasn't entirely lost. He was innocent, yet perceptive, and I realized that protecting him was now as important as protecting the company. If Cleveland's ambition came to fruition unchecked, Ethan would inherit not a legacy of values, but a shattered empire and the bitter memory of betrayal. I reached for the phone and dialed John Morrison, my longtime mentor and friend. If anyone could offer perspective on the maelstrom in my own family, it was John. His calm voice answered, carrying the weight of decades of wisdom. I explained the confrontation, sparing nothing: Cleveland's threats, the aggressive tactics, his sense of entitlement. John listened quietly, then spoke. Family business transitions are always delicate. But remember, Bill, the measure of a leader isn't just skill. It's patience, strategy, and foresight. Don't let emotions dictate your next move. Hearing him say that, I felt a flicker of clarity. My anger and humiliation were real, but they couldn't drive my actions. I needed strategy. I needed evidence. I needed a plan to protect the company, the people who depended on it, and the grandson whose trust I held as sacred. I hung up the phone and looked around my office. The scattered papers from Cleveland's outburst seemed insignificant now compared to the larger war unfolding. One thing was certain: this wasn't over, and I would not let him or hope manipulate or intimidate me. I would act, and I would act decisively. And as I set down the glass and straightened my tie, I realized that humiliation could be transformed into determination. Cleveland had challenged me, but he had underestimated the resolve of the man he once called Dad. The next morning I arrived at the office earlier than usual, the early sunlight casting long, soft shadows across the mahogany floors. My desk, once littered with the aftermath of Cleveland's outburst, was now meticulously organized. I moved with deliberate care, the same precision that had guided every business decision for decades. Though the sting of yesterday's confrontation still lingered, I refused to let it dictate my day. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the quiet office, and reviewed the contracts awaiting my attention. My mind, however, kept returning to the words Cleveland had shouted, "I'm not asking permission anymore." Those words weren't just a threat, they were a declaration. He believed he could override not just my authority, but the legacy I had built. I considered the employees, those who had trusted me through the turbulent early years, and the expansions that followed. Protecting them wasn't just a duty, it was a moral imperative. Cleveland saw them as expendable numbers on a spreadsheet. I saw their families, their lives intertwined with ours through years of loyalty and care. The thought that my own son could disregard that bond made my stomach tighten. My phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Even in the morning quiet, his small voice carried an urgency that reminded me of what mattered most. The boy had witnessed things his parents had hoped to conceal, and he had trusted me enough to speak. That trust anchored me. It reminded me that though Cleveland sought to undermine me, not all was lost. Some part of my family still honored honesty and courage. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of reflection. 30 years of growth, every milestone earned with sweat and sacrifice, had brought me here, not just as a leader, but as a custodian of a legacy. Cleveland's aggression, his threats, his sense of entitlement were serious, but they were manageable. I had faced crises before, albeit not from the hands of my own blood. Yet those experiences had honed me, taught me patience, strategy, and the value of measured action. I picked up the phone and called my mentor, John Morrison, for a final check of perspective. "Don't rush," he said simply. "Observe, gather facts, and act decisively when the time is right. Your authority comes not just from ownership, but from the wisdom you've earned." His words resonated deeply. I realized that in this battle, restraint was as potent a weapon as any legal or financial maneuver. By mid-morning, I had mapped a plan. I would document every interaction, every threat, every suspicious act. Evidence would become my shield, preparation, my sword. Cleveland's ambition would meet structure, strategy, and foresight. And as I looked toward the horizon, the lake shimmering beyond the office windows, I felt a renewed determination to protect my company, to safeguard my employees, and to preserve the family values Cleveland seemed intent on destroying. Humiliation had ignited me, but it would not consume me. I would turn this betrayal into action, a calculated response that ensured the legacy I built would survive intact and unshakable, and that those who betrayed it would face the consequences. Cleveland had declared war, but I was ready not just to defend, but to prevail. The very next morning, Cleveland arrived at my office carrying a silver tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a plate of pastries. The sight of him, so polished, so deliberate, nearly made me laugh out loud. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had threatened to strip me of everything I had built, and now he appeared as if nothing had happened. "Dad," he began with a contrite smile. "I was out of line yesterday. I thought maybe we could talk things over." His tone dripped with practiced humility, but I had spent decades reading men across boardroom tables. His sudden remorse felt rehearsed, like a play performed for an audience of one. Still, I accepted the coffee cup he offered, noting the familiar roast. It was from the same little cafe he used to frequent during his college days, the one he'd introduced to me proudly years ago. The warmth of the porcelain felt comforting in my hand, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to hope this gesture was genuine. But then I saw it, his eyes tracking me too closely as I lifted the cup. It was subtle but unmistakable. He was waiting, measuring as though the real negotiation lay not in words, but in whether or not I would take that sip. I set the cup down after a single swallow, the taste slightly bitterer than I remembered. "You don't have to bribe me with coffee to talk, son," I said evenly, though my chest tightened with unease. He chuckled, waving off my suspicion, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. We talked for nearly an hour, but the conversation was hollow. He agreed with everything I said, nodding, smiling, pretending to concede ground he never intended to surrender. It was a performance, one designed to disarm me. Yet behind the polished manners, I could feel the pulse of his ambition beating stronger than ever. By mid-afternoon, a wave of dizziness washed over me, sudden and disorienting. My pen slipped from my hand, clattering onto the desk. I steadied myself, gripping the chair's armrest, until the room stopped spinning. I told myself it was fatigue, maybe stress, but deep down I knew better. My instincts, honed by years of surviving both business storms and personal disappointments, whispered a chilling possibility. Something in that coffee had not been what it seemed. The humiliation of yesterday had been bad enough, but now I sensed something darker. Cleveland hadn't come to reconcile, he had come to weaken me, to strip me of strength little by little until I was too frail to resist his demands. I stared at the untouched pastry on the tray, its glaze shining under the office light, and a cold shiver ran through me. My son wasn't just willing to humiliate me publicly. He was willing to poison me privately. That realization struck like a hammer against the fragile bond I still hoped existed between us. And in that moment, I made myself a silent vow if Cleveland thought I was too old to fight back. He had just handed me the reason and the resolve to prove him wrong. By nightfall, my body felt like a traitor. What began as a faint dizziness in the office had grown into a relentless storm of nausea and weakness. I barely managed the drive home, gripping the steering wheel tighter than ever before. Each turn of the road, demanding focus, I usually gave effortlessly. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of quiet that normally brought comfort. But this evening it felt oppressive, as if the silence itself were waiting to swallow me. I loosened my tie and hung my coat, with careful precision, the way a soldier might handle a uniform after battle. My legs trembled slightly beneath me. In the study, I poured 2 fingers of whiskey, hoping it would steady my hands, but the glass shook so violently that a few drops spilled onto the carpet. I settled into the leather chair that had held me through decades of triumphs and setbacks, staring at the photographs that lined the shelves. Cleveland's graduation portrait caught my eye, the young man beaming with pride, the same boy who once begged me to explain how gears worked in the garage. I pressed my forehead into my palm. How had that boy turned into the man who handed me a poisoned cup of coffee with a smile? The night dragged on like an unending punishment. Around 11, the nausea surged, forcing me to the bathroom. Cold sweat pooled on my skin, and my head throbbed as though a hammer pounded from within. Each hour brought a fresh wave of torment, headaches, weakness, waves of sickness that stole my breath. At 3 in the morning, I found myself sitting on the bathroom floor, my back against the cool tile, clutching my ribs as my body convulsed. "This isn't stress," I muttered aloud. "This isn't age. It was deliberate." I could feel it in the way the illness came in waves, as though something foreign coursed through my system. I staggered back to bed near dawn, exhausted, but unable to sleep. Each tick of the clock felt heavier than the last, marking not just the passage of time, but the erosion of my strength. I considered calling my doctor, but then dismissed the thought. A viral infection or food poisoning didn't explain Cleveland's watchful eyes as I sipped that coffee. No, this was more than illness. This was intent. Yet even as my body protested, my mind grew sharper. If Cleveland thought he could weaken me into submission, he had underestimated the resilience that built this company, the endurance that had carried me through decades of storms. He believed he could wear me down quietly without confrontation. He was wrong. As the first light of morning seeped through the curtains, I pulled myself upright, every muscle aching. I went to my desk, opened a fresh notebook, and began writing down the timeline when the symptoms began, what I had consumed, how they progressed. If my son was turning this into a battlefield, then I would arm myself with evidence. The sickness might have attacked my body, but it had awakened something stronger inside me, resolve. Cleveland had declared war, but I was preparing my counterstrike. By the next afternoon, my body still felt drained, though the nausea had dulled to a restless churn in my stomach. I forced myself through the motions at the office, answering emails, signing paperwork, trying to maintain the rhythm of leadership that had defined my life. But the fog in my head lingered, reminding me of the bitter taste of Cleveland's coffee. I refused to let it show outwardly. If my son thought I was weak, I would mask it with discipline. Around 3 o'clock, my office phone rang. I expected a client or perhaps my attorney. Instead, it was Hope's warm, measured voice. "Dad," she began as though she'd been practicing Cleveland, "and I were worried about you. You haven't seemed yourself lately. I thought maybe a good hearty meal would help." She spoke with the softness of a nurse, a woman trained to comfort, but something about her tone rang hollow. I hesitated, letting silence answer for me at first. My instinct screamed caution, yet she pressed on. "I'm making my special pot roast tonight. You know, the one Ethan loves. It has all the healing herbs I learned about during my training. Please let us take care of you for a night." The words "healing herbs" lodged in my chest, like a shard of glass. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore Cleveland's bitter coffee yesterday, my sudden illness, and now Hope offering me a carefully prepared meal. Still, I knew refusing outright would raise suspicion. I needed to play along to see just how far this charade would go. 7 o'clock, I asked evenly, my voice betraying nothing. She brightened immediately. "Perfect. Ethan's been asking about you, too. He'll be so glad to spend time with his grandpa." The mention of Ethan tugged at my heart. That boy was the only anchor in this storm of betrayal. I couldn't bear the thought of losing his trust, or worse, exposing him to the fallout of his parents' schemes. Yet I also knew his innocence might be my shield. If they thought he was watching, they'd tread more carefully. Or so I hoped. After hanging up, I sat back in my chair, fingers steepled under my chin. My mind replayed the previous night's torment, the sudden weakness, the pounding headache. A pattern was emerging, and it was impossible to dismiss. I wrote the details into the notebook again, adding invitation to dinner. Possible continuation of attempt. At 6:30, I left the office and drove through the quiet suburbs toward their home in Westlake. The streets were lined with tall oaks, their leaves swaying in the evening breeze, the kind of peaceful setting that belied the treachery waiting behind closed doors. As I pulled into the driveway, I forced my breathing to steady. When Ethan burst through the front door before I could knock, his arms wrapping around my waist with fierce affection, my resolve solidified. His innocence deserved protection, no matter what his parents had planned. "Grandpa, wait till you see what I've been working on," he said excitedly, tugging me toward the living room. Behind him, I caught sight of Cleveland and Hope moving about the kitchen, their movements smooth, precise, rehearsed. Dinner, it seemed, was more than a family meal. It was a stage set for something far darker. Ethan and I settled on the couch, his small hands gripping a video game controller, as he launched into an eager explanation about building cities and managing resources. I tried to follow along, but my eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen. Through the open floor plan, I could see Cleveland arranging place settings with meticulous care, Hope stirring something on the stove. Their movements were calm, almost cheerful, but to me they looked like actors in a sinister play. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Cleveland called, his voice forced into a tone of cheer. "Hope's making her famous pot roast. Just what you need to feel strong again, Dad." Ethan's smile faltered. I caught it the way his shoulders tensed, his fingers fidgeting on the buttons of the controller without really playing. My instincts, sharpened by decades of reading men in boardrooms, now focused on a child's nervous tells. Something was troubling him. I leaned closer. "Everything all right, buddy?" I asked softly, keeping my voice low. His eyes darted toward the kitchen, then back to me. He set the controller down, his face suddenly serious, far too serious for a boy his age. He whispered, "Grandpa, I need to tell you something important." My pulse quickened. "What is it, son?" He leaned in so close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. "I heard my parents talking. They're putting drops in your food. They said it would make you sick, so you'd give them the company." The world froze around me. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. The clatter of pots in the kitchen sounded distant, unreal. Ethan's words had confirmed what my instincts had screamed all along. My own son, my flesh and blood, was plotting to poison me for control of the empire I had built. "What exactly did you hear?" I asked carefully, keeping my voice steady though my insides trembled. "Mom was mixing something into soup." Ethan whispered quickly, his small hands trembling. "Dad said it would make you too weak to run the business anymore." "I don't want them to hurt you, Grandpa." I took his hands into mine, squeezing them gently, grounding both of us in that moment. "You did the right thing telling me. You're very brave." My voice was calm, but inside me a storm raged: fury, sorrow, disbelief. How had it come to this? I forced myself to think clearly. "Can you promise me something important?" He nodded solemnly, eyes wide with fear. "Don't tell your parents we had this conversation. Let me handle it. You're safe, Ethan, and I'll make sure you stay that way." He nodded again, swallowing hard. The innocence in his eyes was shadowed now by a knowledge no child should carry. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, shaken, but my hands no longer trembled from illness. They shook from controlled rage. I pulled out my phone, dialed 911, and whispered the words I never imagined saying. "My son is trying to poison me." I locked the bathroom door and pressed the phone tight against my ear, lowering my voice to a whisper. 911. "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "My son is trying to poison me." I said the words, tasting bitter and unreal. "I'm at his house, 1247 Oak Street in Westlake. He and his wife are preparing dinner right now." My grandson overheard them talking about putting something in my food. There was a pause then, the dispatcher's calm, firm tone. "Units are being dispatched immediately. Stay calm. Can you avoid confrontation until they arrive?" "Yes. I'll delay them." My eyes flicked toward the door, half expecting footsteps. "Please, there's a 10-year-old child here. He's the one who warned me. We'll be there in 15 minutes. Keep your voice low. Act normal. Do not eat or drink anything." I flushed the toilet, and ran the sink to maintain the illusion of a bathroom visit. Staring into the mirror, I forced my face into neutrality, masking the rage boiling beneath. My own son, my own blood. And yet his ambition had turned him into something unrecognizable, a stranger willing to trade his father's life for power. When I stepped back into the hallway, Cleveland called from the dining room, his tone too bright, too eager. "Dad, come join us." Hope's made something special. The table had been set like a holiday feast, fine china cloth, napkins, flowers in the center. Hope ladled soup into my bowl with almost ceremonial care. "Special herbs just for you," she said. Her smile trained her eyes, evaluating. I took my seat at the head of the table, Ethan across from me, his small shoulders tense, his gaze flicking nervously between us. My stomach churned, not from sickness, but from fury held in check. Cleveland lifted his water glass in a toast. "To family healing and new beginnings," he said. The irony nearly choked me. I raised my glass, but I didn't drink. I pushed the soup slightly away. "I'm not very hungry tonight," I murmured. Cleveland's jaw tightened. "Dad, you need nourishment. You've been sick for 2 days." Hope stepped closer, her voice urgent but honeyed. "Without proper nutrition, you can't recover." Their pressure grew heavier with each refusal, but I held firm. Every second I delayed was a second closer to salvation. Then the sound that broke the charade. A hard knock at the front door, followed by an authoritative voice. "Police, open the door." Cleveland froze, the color draining from his face. "Who called the police?" His eyes darted between Hope and me, suspicion dawning. Hope's ladle clattered to the floor, the clang echoing through the house. Ethan slipped quietly from his chair, moving toward me, seeking protection. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders as heavy footsteps crossed the porch. "Cleveland Thompson, open the door immediately," the officer's voice commanded. The front door swung wide, and 3 uniformed officers stepped in, badges glinting under the chandelier. The warmth of the staged dinner turned instantly cold, the feast transformed into evidence. "Sir, we received a report of attempted poisoning," the lead detective said to me. I rose slowly, keeping Ethan close. "That report is true. My son and his wife tried to kill me." Cleveland's protests sputtered from his lips. Denials, excuses, all collapsing under the weight of truth. But the handcuffs clicking shut told me what I already knew: the trap had sprung and justice had arrived. The warmth of the dining room evaporated the moment the officers entered. Their heavy boots thudded against the hardwood, and the clink of their gear drowned out the forced cheer that had filled the air seconds earlier. Cleveland's eyes darted wildly, searching for control he no longer had. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking a far cry from the confidence he had displayed in my office days before. Hope stood frozen beside the stove, her hands trembling, eyes wide as if she'd just realized her carefully spun web had unraveled. "Everyone step away from the table," Detective Martinez ordered, his tone sharp, leaving no room for debate. The officers moved swiftly, separating us from the steaming bowls still sitting untouched. One officer began photographing the spread, his camera flashes capturing every detail: the ladle still dripping broth, the fine china set for a celebration, and my untouched bowl of soup. Each flash of light was like a nail hammered into the coffin of Cleveland's plan. Ethan clung to me, his small frame pressed against my side. I could feel the tension in his body, the unspoken question of whether he was truly safe now. I bent down and whispered, "You did the bravest thing, son. Stay close to me." His little nod was enough to give me strength in that moment. "Sir, are you William Thompson?" Martinez asked. "I am," I answered, steadying my voice. "My son and his wife attempted to poison me. My grandson overheard their plan. The detective's gaze swept toward Cleveland and Hope. Cleveland scoffed bitterly. "Poison, we invited you for dinner. This is insane." His words tumbled over each other, desperation seeping through, but the evidence spoke louder than his denials. Another officer unscrewed the small container of herbs Hope had been using. He sniffed, frowned, and sealed it into an evidence bag. Hope finally broke her silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what it looks like." But her shaking hands betrayed her words. "Ma'am," the detective replied firmly, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The click of handcuffs around her wrists seemed to echo louder than the chandelier's light could soften. Cleveland, too, found himself restrained, the polished metal binding the same hands that once held tools beside me in the garage hands I had been so proud of. He looked at me across the room, eyes filled with panic and something else, betrayal, as though I were the one who had wronged him. "Dad, how could you do this? How could you turn against your own family?" The irony cut deeper than the cuffs ever could. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years of love twisted into this nightmarish moment. "You meant to kill me, Cleveland. You stopped being family the moment you chose power over blood." Outside, red and blue lights painted the quiet street. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, their murmurs blending with the wail of sirens. Inside, the family I thought I had was being led out in chains, and though my heart cracked under the weight of it, I knew this was only the beginning of a long and bitter reckoning. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, securing every dish, every container, every fragment of the so-called healing herbs. The dining room, once staged as a celebration, had transformed into a crime scene under harsh police scrutiny. But Cleveland wouldn't surrender his control so easily. His voice rose in protest, sharp and desperate, filling the space with a false conviction. "This is ridiculous. You think I'd poison my own father? He's exaggerating, he's old. He doesn't know what he's saying." Detective Martinez didn't flinch. He gestured for another officer to continue bagging evidence. "Sir, you'll have your chance to speak in court. For now, you're under investigation for attempted poisoning." Cleveland's eyes burned with fury. He twisted his wrists against the cuffs, glaring at me across the table. "You're destroying this family. You've always been too stubborn, too blind to see what's best." I was trying to protect our future. I held his gaze, my own voice steady, though my heart ached with every word. "You weren't protecting the future, son. You were trying to erase me from it." His face contorted, pride battling with panic. "You can't even prove anything. You drank the coffee yesterday, didn't you? Maybe you're just sick. Maybe this is all in your head." Ethan flinched at the sound of his father's voice. The boy tightened his grip on my arm, pressing his face into my sleeve, as though trying to block out the venom spilling from his father's mouth. I pulled him closer, shielding him with my presence. "Don't listen to him," I whispered softly, though loud enough for Cleveland to hear. "You spoke the truth, Ethan. That's more powerful than any lie." Hope, still pale and trembling, tried to interject. "Please, he doesn't understand. It was just a supplement, just something to help with digestion." But her voice cracked, betraying the practiced calm she tried to maintain. One of the officers read aloud from the label of the seized container. "Substance is unmarked, no manufacturer's information. We'll send this to the lab immediately." His eyes narrowed as he looked from Cleveland to Hope. "You don't serve unmarked substances to anyone, especially not an elderly man recovering from illness." The neighbors outside had multiplied their silhouettes, crowding the windows, whispers floating through the night. The humiliation Cleveland had once tried to hurl at me in private was now spilling out for the world to see. His ambition, his deceit, his betrayal, it was no longer hidden behind boardroom doors. "Dad, He spat the word now like an insult. You've always been weak. You hide behind loyalty and sentiment, and that's why the company will die with you. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't let the hurt show. Instead, I answered with the truth that had sustained me for decades. The company was built on loyalty and sentiment. Without them, it's nothing but an empty shell. You wanted to inherit a legacy, Cleveland, but you've proven you don't deserve one. The officers led him toward the front door, his protests echoing down the hallway. The flashing red and blue lights swallowed his defiance, turning it into something small, pitiful, powerless. For the first time that night, I let out a long breath. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had begun to turn. The dining room no longer looked like the heart of a family home. It resembled a stage stripped bare, every prop now evidence in a criminal case. Officers moved quietly but firmly, photographing dishes, bagging utensils, and sealing every container with methodical precision. The clatter of latex gloves snapping and the scratch of pens on evidence tags replaced the false warmth Cleveland and Hope had tried to project. Through it all, Ethan sat beside me, his small hands twisting nervously in his lap. His wide eyes followed every movement, yet he never looked away, even when the officers opened the container of herbs and documented its bitter, acrid scent. Most children his age would have hidden or cried, but Ethan remained steady, watching as the truth he had carried alone was finally acknowledged by adults who believed him. I placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of my palm both reassurance and gratitude. "You saved my life tonight," I whispered, leaning close so only he could hear. He looked up, his voice small but firm. "I just didn't want them to hurt you, Grandpa." Those words struck me harder than any of Cleveland's insults. My grandson, at only 10 years old, had shown more courage and integrity than his father, a grown man, who had chosen greed over loyalty. Ethan had broken the cycle. Where Cleveland saw power, Ethan saw people. Where Cleveland schemed in shadows, Ethan stepped into the light. Detective Martinez approached with a notepad. "Mr. Thompson will need a formal statement from you and arrangements for your grandson's safety. It's clear he's a key witness." I nodded firmly. "He stays with me. From this moment on, he stays with me." Ethan pressed closer into my side, his head resting against my arm as though sealing that promise. From across the room, Cleveland tried one last tactic, his voice rising above the methodical hum of the investigation. "Ethan, don't you see? He's manipulating you. He's trying to turn you against us." His words cracked desperation, dripping from every syllable. But Ethan didn't move toward him. Instead, he buried his face against me, his voice muffled but strong. "You're the ones who tried to hurt him. I heard you." The boy's declaration hung in the air, sharp as any gavel. The officers glanced at each other, the power of his testimony undeniable even outside a courtroom. Hope crumbled, then tears spilling down her cheeks, though whether they were born of remorse or fear of prison, I couldn't tell. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," she stammered. "It was supposed to be temporary, just enough to make him step aside." Martinez's eyes hardened. "Ma'am, poisoning isn't temporary. It's attempted murder." As her sobs filled the room, I looked down at Ethan, who was watching everything with a mix of fear and determination. I stroked his hair silently, marveling at his strength. A child had carried the burden of truth in a house filled with lies, and tonight, that truth had saved us both. For years, I had believed my legacy would live on through Cleveland. But as I held Ethan close, I realized my legacy was already here in the bravery of a boy who chose honesty over silence, love over betrayal. Detective Martinez gave a short nod to his team, and the officers moved with quiet precision, sweeping the kitchen for anything that might confirm intent. Drawers opened, cabinets were inspected, and every item that looked even remotely suspicious was catalogued. One officer retrieved a small brown vial tucked behind the spice rack. He held it up under the light, the liquid inside dark and viscous. "Unmarked, no label," he announced. Another officer snapped photos as the vial was placed into an evidence bag and sealed. Hope let out a strangled cry. "That's not poison, it's just something I mixed from my nursing days. Herbs to calm digestion." But the quaver in her voice betrayed her. Martinez's tone was firm, unyielding. "Ma'am, if it was safe, you would have labeled it. You don't hide medicine in unmarked bottles." Cleveland tried to lean forward despite the cuffs biting into his wrists. "You're blowing this out of proportion. Dad's sick because he's old, not because of us. You think some bottle in a kitchen proves anything?" The officer holding the evidence glanced toward Martinez. "We'll let the lab confirm, but the timing fits his symptoms exactly. Weakness, nausea, dizziness, classic markers of poisoning." Cleveland's face drained of color. For the first time, his bravado slipped, replaced by the raw realization that his carefully woven scheme was unraveling faster than he could protest. "You can't do this to me," he hissed, his eyes locking on mine. "You raised me to take over. This company is mine by right." I stood tall, Ethan still pressed against my side, his small hand gripping mine tightly. My voice came out steady, carrying the weight of decades of sacrifice. "A legacy isn't taken, Cleveland. It's earned. And tonight you showed the world you don't deserve it." Hope sagged against the counter, her composure breaking completely. Her sobs filled the room as an officer read her rights aloud, her hands trembling as they were pulled behind her back for the cuffs. She looked more like a shadow of herself than the polished daughter-in-law who had once brought me homemade pies at Christmas. The neighbors' murmurs outside grew louder as the officers escorted Cleveland and Hope toward the front door. The flashing red and blue lights cut across their faces, exposing every crack in their carefully curated facade. The family that had once projected unity now marched out like criminals, their reputations shattered under the gaze of the community. Detective Martinez turned to me. "Mr. Thompson, you'll need to come to the station tomorrow for a formal statement. For tonight, we've got enough to hold them on attempted murder. And your grandson will be placed in your temporary custody until further orders." I nodded, glancing down at Ethan. His face was pale but determined, his eyes never leaving the sight of his parents being led away. I bent down and whispered, "You're safe now. You did the hardest part." As the door shut behind the officers and their prisoners, the house fell silent again, though not with the oppressive quiet of before. This silence carried a strange relief. The evidence was secured, the arrests were made, and though the pain of betrayal cut deep, justice had taken its first solid step. I held Ethan close and felt his heartbeat against mine. We were both survivors of this night, and together we would walk into whatever came next. The front door shut behind the officers, their voices carrying down the walkway as they loaded Cleveland and Hope into separate squad cars. The red and blue lights outside flickered through the windows, washing the walls in a kaleidoscope of judgment. For years, I had imagined Cleveland standing in this doorway as my successor, welcoming clients or celebrating family milestones. Instead, I watched him step through it in handcuffs, his future reduced to police reports and court dates. Even restrained, his voice carried like a curse. "Dad, how could you do this? How could you betray your own family?" His eyes locked on mine as the officer guided him forward. His words dripped with the same venom he had unleashed in my office, but now they rang hollow. The irony made my chest ache. "I could ask you the same question," I answered quietly, steady enough for Ethan to hear, firm enough for Cleveland to feel. You tried to kill me, son. That is the betrayal. For a moment his face contorted with something raw, anger, fear, perhaps even regret. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried under the mask of pride he had worn since the first day he thought himself my equal. He turned his head sharply as the car door closed, shutting off any chance of reconciliation. Hope followed moments later, her sobs uncontrolled mascara streaking her cheeks as the officers recited her rights. She looked at me once, her lips trembling as though searching for words of apology, but none came. The cuffs clicked into place, and she was led past the crowd of neighbors whispering on the sidewalk, their shocked stares burning holes into the night. Inside the house, the silence returned. But this time it wasn't the suffocating silence of dread, it was the heavy quiet that comes after a storm has passed. Ethan clung to my arm, his small body trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. I knelt in front of him, looking into his wide eyes. "You were braver tonight than most grown men I've ever known," I said. "Don't you ever forget that." He nodded, but his voice wavered when he asked the question no child should have to form. "Do you think Mom and Dad still love me?" The weight of his words nearly broke me, yet I forced strength into my reply. "Yes, Ethan. They love you. But they made choices, terrible choices, about money and power. Those choices don't change their love, but they do have consequences." I wrapped him in my arms, and together we sat in the quiet dining room, the untouched food cooling on the table. The same table that had nearly become my coffin was now just another piece of evidence. As I listened to the distant hum of the patrol cars fading down the street, I realized the humiliation that had begun in my office had transformed into something far larger. This was no longer just about a company or even my survival. It was about protecting Ethan, about proving that integrity could endure even when blood ties were severed by greed. The war Cleveland had declared was not yet over. But tonight, for the first time, I believed I could win. 8 days later, I walked up the stone steps of the Cuyahoga County Courthouse with Ethan's small hand locked tightly in mine. The building rose before us like a cathedral of judgment, its columns towering against the gray Ohio sky. Each step felt heavier than the last. I had faced rivals across boardroom tables, signed contracts worth millions, even weathered recessions, but nothing compared to the weight of walking into court to testify against my own son. Inside the courtroom buzzed with hushed voices. The polished wood benches creaked as families and lawyers took their places. A bailiff's voice cut through the air, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Williams." Everyone stood, and the judge entered with solemn authority, her black robe flowing like a cloak of truth. Across the aisle, I saw Cleveland and Hope seated with their attorneys. They wore the county's orange jumpsuits, though even prison uniforms couldn't strip Cleveland of the arrogance etched into his posture. He sat tall, his chin lifted, as if daring the world to doubt his version of events. Hope, however, looked diminished. Her shoulders, hunched eyes cast down as though avoiding the gaze of the very people she had once welcomed into her home. The state of Ohio versus Cleveland Thompson, and Hope Thompson, charged with attempted murder in the first degree, Judge Williams read. Her words echoed in the chamber final and chilling. She nodded to the prosecutor. "Counselor, you may proceed." The prosecutor rose methodical and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about business disputes or family disagreements. It is about trust betrayed in the most dangerous way through poison. The evidence will show that the defendants, motivated by greed, attempted to incapacitate William Thompson in order to seize control of his company." Cleveland's attorney leapt to his feet during cross-examination, painting me as an overworked aging executive prone to paranoia. "Isn't it true?" he asked with a smug grin that your client has been under significant stress and that his symptoms could have been caused by natural illness, not deliberate poisoning. The prosecutor countered, swiftly calling expert witnesses. A toxicologist testified that the substances found in the soup and the coffee matched my symptoms with precision. A crime scene technician displayed photos of the unlabeled vial taken from Cleveland's kitchen. Each piece of evidence stacked higher, the weight pressing down on the defense. When my name was called, I rose slowly, the eyes of the courtroom fixed on me. I walked to the witness stand, the wooden floor creaking under my steps. My hand trembled slightly as I swore to tell the truth, but my voice was steady when I began. Cleveland is my son. Hope is my daughter-in-law. And they tried to kill me. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Speaking those words aloud was like stabbing a blade into my own chest. But I knew they had to be said. For the first time in my life, I wasn't defending my company or my legacy. I was defending my very survival and the truth itself. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt as though I had shed 20 pounds of grief onto the courtroom floor. Yet I knew the heaviest testimony was still to come, not from me, but from the boy who had saved my life. The prosecutor stood and addressed Judge Williams. Your Honor, the state would like to call Ethan Thompson, age 10, to testify via closed-circuit television. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the jurors shifted in their seats as though struck by the gravity of placing a child at the heart of such a grim case. Judge Williams nodded solemnly. Granted. We will hear from the minor under protective conditions. A screen flickered to life beside the jury box, showing Ethan seated in a separate room, a victim's advocate by his side. He looked small in the oversized chair, but his back was straight, his chin lifted. The sight of him filled me with both pride and sorrow. No child should have to shoulder such a burden, yet here he was, stronger than many adults I had known. The prosecutor spoke gently. Ethan, can you tell the court in your own words what you heard at your home on the night in question? Ethan's voice was soft but steady. I heard my mom and dad in the kitchen. Mom was mixing something in a pot, and Dad said it would make Grandpa weak, so he couldn't run the company anymore. His small hands fidgeted in his lap, but his gaze never wavered from the camera. I didn't want them to hurt him, so I told Grandpa. The prosecutor nodded. And why did you decide to tell him? Because I love him, Ethan answered simply. And because it was wrong. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even hardened lawyers and distant jurors couldn't disguise their reaction to the boy's unvarnished truth. Cleveland's attorney rose for cross-examination, his voice sharper than it should have been with a child. Ethan, isn't it possible you misunderstood? Adults talk about medicine and health all the time. Maybe you just imagined they said something bad. Ethan shook his head firmly. I didn't imagine it. I know what I heard. The attorney tried again. You care about your grandfather, don't you? Maybe you just wanted to help him, so you made up a story. For the first time, Ethan's eyes flashed with something beyond fear, righteous anger. I didn't make it up. They were trying to hurt him, and I couldn't keep it secret. His words, unpolished and pure, carried more weight than any rehearsed argument. Across the aisle, I saw Cleveland shift uncomfortably, his jaw clenched. Hope's face crumpled into her hands. The judge leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. The record will reflect the clarity of the witness's testimony. On the screen, Ethan glanced sideways, perhaps imagining I could see him through the camera, and though we were in different rooms, I whispered under my breath, "You've done more than enough, son. More than enough." The prosecutor wasted no time following Ethan's testimony. With the jury still digesting the boy's brave words, She shifted the focus to the mountain of scientific evidence. The state calls Dr. Angela Miller forensic toxicologist, she announced. Dr. Miller, a poised woman in her 50s, stepped into the witness box. She laid out her credentials with quiet authority, 2 decades of lab work, dozens of cases involving chemical analysis. She was the kind of expert jurors trusted instinctively. "Doctor," the prosecutor began, "what did you find when you tested the food samples taken from the defendant's home?" Dr. Miller adjusted her glasses. "We found traces of scopolamine and digitalis substances not commonly found in household kitchens. In controlled doses, they cause dizziness, nausea, weakness, and confusion. In higher doses, they can be lethal." The prosecutor nodded, letting the weight of the words settle. "And do the symptoms described by Mr. Thompson align with exposure to these substances?" "They align precisely," Dr. Miller said. "The onset, progression, and intensity match the pharmacological profile. His reported dizziness and nausea after coffee followed by severe nighttime episodes are consistent with repeated exposure." A hush swept the courtroom. Jurors scribbled furiously in their notebooks. I felt my hands grip the edge of the bench, each word confirming what I had already lived through. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his tone biting. "Doctor, isn't it possible these substances could come from natural sources, herbs perhaps?" "Something an inexperienced cook might not realize contained trace toxins." Dr. Miller didn't flinch. "Not in the concentrations we found. These were measured doses, deliberate and controlled. This was not an accident with herbs, it was intentional poisoning." The prosecutor called the crime scene technician next. He presented photos taken in Cleveland's kitchen: the unmarked vial, the open container of soup, the tray of coffee cups. Enlarged images of the vial were displayed for the jury, the liquid inside dark and menacing. "Tests confirmed the same substances Dr. Miller identified," the technician explained. "It was no spice jar. It was a weapon." Hope let out a quiet sob, covering her face with her cuffed hands. Cleveland, however, leaned forward, his jaw-tight eyes darting across the jury as though daring them to doubt the evidence. The prosecutor pressed the final point. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard from the victim, from his grandson, and from experts. This was no misunderstanding, no accident. It was premeditated. These defendants sought to incapacitate William Thompson to seize control of his company. They did not care if it cost him his life." I looked toward the jurors, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. In that moment, I knew the tide had turned fully. This wasn't about family drama anymore. It was about justice. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It was laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom grew tense as the prosecutor rested her case. Weeks of anguished testimony and evidence had been poured into this trial, and now all that remained was judgment. Judge Williams addressed the jury with calm authority. "You have heard the evidence. You must decide whether the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendants attempted to murder William Thompson. You are excused to deliberate." The 12 jurors filed out their faces, solemn, carrying with them the weight of my family's future. The courtroom fell into an uneasy quiet. I sat rigid on the bench, Ethan's small hand tucked in mine, his thumb brushing nervously over my knuckles. Across the aisle, Cleveland leaned back in his chair, his cuffed hands resting on the defense table. He still wore that mask of confidence, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. Hope sat beside him, shoulders slumped, whispering silently to herself, prayer or despair, I couldn't tell. Minutes stretched into hours. Every tick of the clock echoed like a hammer. Finally, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The jury has reached a verdict. The jurors re-entered their faces unreadable. My heart pounded so hard, I could feel it in my throat. The forewoman stood a folded paper in her hand. Judge Williams asked the question that would change everything. "Madam Forewoman, how do you find the defendants?" The forewoman's voice was steady. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find both Cleveland Thompson and Hope Thompson guilty." The words struck like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Ethan buried his face in my sleeve and I pulled him close, whispering, "It's over, son. It's over." Cleveland's composure shattered. "No," he shouted, surging forward as the bailiff restrained him. "You can't do this, Dad. Tell them you know I didn't mean it." His eyes locked onto mine, desperate pleading. For a moment I searched his face for the boy I once knew, the boy who helped me move machinery in a dusty garage, who grinned at me with grease-stained hands. But that boy was gone, buried under layers of greed and entitlement. Judge Williams's gavel struck once, silencing the uproar. Order in the court. The defendants will be sentenced immediately. She looked directly at Cleveland and Hope, her expression stern but not unkind. Family is meant to be a place of trust, love, and protection. You violated those sacred bonds for personal gain. Such actions cannot go unpunished. Each of you is hereby sentenced to 8 years in state prison. Hope broke into sobs, collapsing against her attorney's shoulder. Cleveland's face twisted with rage. 8 years. My life is over because of you. He spat at me, his voice cracking with bitterness. I stood slowly, my voice calm, steady, and final. "No, son, your life isn't over. But the choices you made tonight have defined you. That was your doing, not mine." The gavel fell again. The case was closed. And as the officers led Cleveland and Hope away, I felt the sharp edge of betrayal finally dull into something else, not relief, but resolution. 4 days after the sentencing, I sat once again in my office at Thompson Manufacturing. The same mahogany desk where Cleveland had once slammed down his demands was now covered with new paperwork, legal documents, drafted by my estate attorney. The hum of the city floated through the window, but inside the room carried a stillness that felt both heavy and purposeful. I signed my name at the bottom of each page, the pen strokes steady, despite the ache that lingered in my chest. "This revision ensures Ethan inherits the company when he turns 25, the attorney explained. "Until then, management will remain in professional hands. Cleveland and Hope are fully removed from all corporate documents." His voice was calm, efficient, but I heard the finality in it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. For years, those photos had symbolized milestones, new factories, new employees, the steady climb of success. But tonight, their meaning had shifted. Success wasn't just revenue or market share. It was the people who could be trusted to carry it forward. Cleveland had forfeited that trust. Ethan, though just a boy, had already proven he possessed the character my son never embraced. When the attorney left, I drove to Edgewater Park as the sun began to set over Lake Erie. Ethan and I had started a new routine, watching the sunset together, just the two of us letting the day fall away into the golden horizon. He sat beside me on the weathered bench, his legs swinging above the ground, his small hand tucked in mine. "Grandpa," he asked quietly, "will I really run the company someday?" His question pierced me with equal parts sorrow and hope. "Only if you want to, Ethan," I told him, squeezing his hand. "You'll have choices. I don't want you to feel trapped by my dreams or anyone else's. What matters most is that you live with honesty, with courage. That's what makes a true leader." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the fiery sky. "I just want to make you proud." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You already have more than you know. You saved me, Ethan. And you reminded me of what really matters. As the sun dipped lower, I realized legacy wasn't about passing down a company or protecting an empire. Legacy was teaching the next generation the value of trust, of truth, of love, stronger than ambition. Cleveland had failed that test, but Ethan had passed it in ways no child should ever have to. The evening breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sounds of laughter from families nearby. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. My son had chosen betrayal, but my grandson had chosen courage. And with that choice, he had saved not just my life, but the future of everything I had built. Betrayal by your own blood is a wound deeper than any other, but it also forces you to see clearly what matters most. My son and daughter-in-law believed power and money were worth more than loyalty, and for that choice they lost their freedom. Yet in the same moment, my grandson showed me that courage, honesty, and love can shine even in the darkest corners of family life. Ethan's whispered warning didn't just save my life. It reminded me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or corporate shares, but in the bonds of trust we nurture and protect. If there is any lesson in my story, it is this: never let greed or bitterness blind you to the people who truly care for you. And for parents listening, if you treat your children as pawns in your ambition, you risk losing the very legacy you hope to preserve. Family is built on more than blood. It's built on choices every single day. Now I want to ask you, have you ever faced betrayal within your own family? How did you handle it, and what did you learn? Share your experiences in the comments so others can draw strength from them. If my story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it. Remember, real legacy is not what we leave in bank accounts or buildings, but in the hearts of those who carry our values forward. Thank you for listening.